Derrick Todd Lee.
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 Serial killer. Derrick Todd Lee.
The capital city of Louisiana, Baton Rouge. The second largest city in the state is located on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. Home to Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge is known for its southern hospitality, enticing tourist attractions, and stunning views of the Mississippi River. It's also one of the major economic and educational hubs of the southern U.S. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was known for something different, something much more sinister. Between 1992 and 2006, Baton Rouge and the surrounding area found itself in the middle of an unrelenting spree of violent murders. Murders that were being carried out simultaneously by at least 3 different men, whose lives and criminal careers we will be exploring over the next 3 weeks. Naturally, we're starting with the first of the 3 to be apprehended and hit the media, the man dubbed the Baton Rouge serial killer. This is the Derrick Todd Lee story. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi. My name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime cases each week. Last week we talked about Kristen Smart, and as soon as I finished filming this video, it was released to the public that Paul Flores was actually arrested in relation to her disappearance. Therefore, everything else I said about the matter in this video became irrelevant. Anyways, if you have an interest in true crime like me and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Derrick was born on November 5th, 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana, to his parents Samuel Ruth and Florence Lee. Florence was just 17 years old when she gave birth to Derrick, who would end up being her only son out of 4 children. Derrick's home life was awful pretty much straight out of the womb, starting with the fact that his biological father was not around for very long after he was born. Samuel suffered from severe mental health issues and actually ended up abandoning the family to reconcile with his first wife. There's also reports that he was committed to a mental institution at one point for trying to murder that woman, so he clearly had some stuff going on. Florence did go on to remarry a man named Colombe, who quickly stepped in as a father to Derrick and his sisters. But, not a very good one. He was, really strict. He and Florence were super religious and had outrageously high expectations of the children, especially when it came to education, and unfortunately this was an area where Derrick really struggled. He was not interested in school at all, and it didn't take long before he was being outperformed by even his youngest sister. He struggled to maintain even poor grades and scored fairly low on standard IQ tests. Derrick's stepfather soon began physically abusing him as well, which his mother knew all about and did absolutely nothing to stop, so that was great. On top of his shitty home life, he was also bullied pretty badly in school for being in special education classes because kids can be kind of just really terrible. All this stress weighed really heavy on Derrick, which caused him to start behaving irregularly pretty early in life. By age 11, he was already known around his neighborhood for being a peeping Tom, which was a hobby that he enjoyed so much that he carried it into his adult life. It's also reported that he liked to fuck with animals, which can be a big warning sign that darker days lie ahead. Derrick's official rap sheet began at age 13 when he was arrested for burglarizing and vandalizing a neighborhood candy store. He pled guilty to these charges and was placed on probation. But hot damn, did he escalate from there. By age 16, he was arrested and charged with attempted second-degree murder because he pulled a knife on a boy during a fight. I'm not exactly sure what ended up happening with those charges, but I do know that he was released fairly quickly. At 17, he was arrested again, this time for his dirty little peeping habit, but despite the fact that he had dropped out of high school and been in trouble constantly since, he somehow managed to avoid spending any time in a juvenile detention center. In 1988, he was arrested again for attempted robbery, charges that were eventually reduced so that Derrick could be released yet again. Following this release, Derrick married a woman named Jacqueline or Jackie Sims. The couple was married on August 17th, 1988, and went on to have 2 children together, a boy named Derrick and a girl named Doris. But unfortunately for Jackie, Derrick was a garbage husband. He was abusive and unfaithful and just high-key kind of an asshole. He also got into multiple altercations with Jackie's father, once even threatening him at gunpoint. And on top of all of this, he would frequently just walk out on her and leave her to figure out a way to take care of their children by herself. Despite these issues, Jackie was a dedicated wife and mother and always forgave Derrick. However, she reported her husband to the police for his abuse and neglect on multiple occasions. Whether it was the stress of his crumbling marriage or something just not quite right. In 1993, Derrick escalated into random acts of violence, which, in my opinion, are the scariest. It's obvious, in my opinion, that Derrick was unhinged for a pretty decent chunk of his life, but up to this point, his violence always seemed to be directed at someone he knew personally or believed had wronged him in some way. Until April 1993. Michelle Chapman and her boyfriend were hanging out in Bueller Plains Cemetery in Zachary, Louisiana, parked in a car, doing what teenagers do, preoccupied and unaware that Derrick was nearby, doing what he do, peeping. Because it was raining and they were distracted, they didn't hear Derrick as he approached the vehicle wielding a machete. He opened the car door and without hesitation started swinging. He hit Michelle's boyfriend in the scalp, arms, and hands, and he hit Michelle in the leg, almost severing her right foot. Michelle later said in an interview, quote, "He was very well dressed. He had on a red plaid shirt and it was tucked inside his pants, and he was clean shaven. The one thing I remember were his eyes, because they were big and bloodshot and full of rage." Unquote. Luckily for Michelle and her boyfriend, Derrick was interrupted when another car's headlights shined in the direction of their Toyota Camry. Derrick took the keys, dropped his machete, and ran. Unable to flee, Michelle and her boyfriend locked the doors and just sat there until a police officer noticed the interior light of the car was on and went over to get a closer look. He discovered Michelle and her boyfriend half-clothed and covered in blood. They were immediately taken to nearby hospitals and a search of the cemetery was conducted. But due to the heavy rainfall that evening, any possible evidence had long since been washed away. Michelle wasn't able to identify her attacker until 6 years later when she picked him out of a photo lineup in 1999. But by then, the statute of limitations on second-degree attempted murder had run out and nothing was done. Now, I couldn't find anywhere that clearly stated what Louisiana's statute of limitations is on attempted murder, but apparently at one point it was less than 6 years, so fun fact. In 1993, Derrick was convicted of burglary and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary. He was paroled in 1995, but was quickly rearrested for his favorite hobby, peeping in windows. His punishment for this was 2 years of unsupervised probation. Pointless? In 1996, Derrick and Jackie unexpectedly came into a pretty decent chunk of money. Jackie had been awarded $250,000 as a settlement from her father's employer after he was killed in an explosion on the job. Derrick used this newfound wealth to buy lavish gifts for his girlfriend, Cassandra. He blew through the settlement money pretty quick and was once again left barely making ends meet. But things were more difficult financially now because Derrick had a new baby on the way. Cassandra was pregnant with their son, Dedrick, whom she gave birth to in July of 1999. Honestly, I could go on and on. There is a plethora of other things that Derrick was arrested for over the years, but I'm gonna kind of go ahead and move on from the slightly less relevant pre-serial killer era of his life, if that's okay. I do think it's important for you to have some background on his criminal record though, because man, did this guy slip through the cracks just time and time and time again. It's bananas how much this man was able to basically get away with. And we haven't even gotten into the murders yet. No one knows exactly what caused Derrick's violence to escalate into murder, but in 1998, he fully snapped and began mercilessly killing women throughout Baton Rouge and the surrounding areas. The first murder that is conclusively linked to Derrick took place on April 18th, 1998. Randy Mae Brewer was a 28-year-old home health nurse living in Zachary, Louisiana. She was divorced with a 3-year-old son. The morning after she was taken from her home, April 19th, 1998, her son Michael was found by their neighbor Kathy just wandering aimlessly around their yard. When Michael saw Kathy, he got excited and asked if her son could come out to play with him, which Kathy said was fine, but that she would like to talk to Michael's mother, Randy, first. And this is when Michael told Kathy that his mother was lost and that he couldn't find her. Concerned, Kathy took Michael and entered the home with him. Pretty much right away, she noticed that there was blood on the kitchen floor. And as she made her way through the house, she found more and more blood in every room. She eventually grabbed Michael and ran back to her house to get her husband husband, and together the couple called the police. To this day, Randy's body has never been found. Her disappearance and probable murder was linked to Derrick later by DNA evidence that had been taken from the home. In June of 1999, Derrick was arrested for stalking a woman and forcing his way into her apartment. Thankfully, Colette Walker was able to talk her way out of and de-escalate the situation. Derrick left her apartment peacefully after simply giving her his phone number, which would have been a relief if over the next few weeks, Derrick hadn't been caught loitering in her apartment parking lot and looking into her windows. Unfortunately for Colette and, society, Derrick pled guilty to the charges and was released on supervised probation. After his release, he immediately went looking for Colette. But by the time he got to her apartment, thankfully, she had already moved the fuck out. She was probably so lucky because who knows what he was planning on doing if he found her. Chances are she would not have made it out alive a second time. In February of 2000, Cassandra filed a request for a protective order against Derrick. Their relationship had become extremely volatile and physically violent, and she was scared for her life. And she was right to be fearful because less than a week after she filed this request, Derrick tracked her down and beat the absolute crap out of her in the parking lot of a local bar. He was arrested for this and spent a year in prison. He was released in February of 2001, but by May had been re-arrested for violating his parole. But he received nothing more than a stern talking to for this. His parole was not revoked and he was not sent back to prison. I just cannot fathom how he managed to commit all of these horrible crimes and consistently just received nothing other than a slap on the wrist. These oversights would ultimately prove tragic for so many families. On September 24th, 2001, Gina Wilson Green, a 41-year-old nurse, failed to show up for her shift at work. This was extremely out of character for her, so much so that a coworker of hers actually offered to drive over to her house just to see if she was okay, and unfortunately, she was not. Derrick had raped and strangled her to death. Gina had reportedly mentioned to friends and family, feeling as though she was being followed or watched in the weeks leading up to her death. Police were able to obtain a DNA sample from the perpetrator from the scene, but not much else. And since it didn't generate any matches in the DNA database, honestly, the DNA was kind of a bust at first too. And on January 14th, 2002, 21-year-old Geraldine DeSoto, a student at Louisiana State University, was found by her husband dead in their home. She had been savagely beaten and stabbed to death by Derrick. Due to the violent struggle that had taken place before her death, police were able to gather DNA from her attacker from under her fingernails, but they were unable to match it to anyone at first. 4.5 months later, on May 31st, 2002, Derrick murdered 22-year-old Charlotte Murray Pace in her apartment. Charlotte was an incredibly bright girl, having graduated high school when she was 15 years old, college when she was 20, and received her master's in business administration by the time she was 22. She likely had an incredible future ahead of her, and it's a shame she never got to experience it. Admirably, Charlotte didn't go quietly. She put up a hell of a fight. Her apartment was absolutely trashed, and she was covered in defensive wounds. Despite putting up the fight of her life, she was ultimately overpowered, raped, and stabbed over 80 times. Her roommate found her body later that same day. The girls had literally been living in the apartment for less than a week. And police were shocked because this was a pretty fucking bold attack. Derrick had committed this murder in the middle of broad daylight in a super populated area right near the university. The entire area around Charlotte's apartment was constantly swarming with students on their way to and from class. Because of this, police were hopeful that if they canvassed the area and spoke to some of the students, that someone would have seen something, but unfortunately, they came up empty-handed. The only evidence they really had was a DNA sample from the rape. The DNA sample was immediately sent to the crime lab for analysis, but it did not generate any matches. Feeling more than a little stumped, police started grasping at straws. They started looking into other unsolved crimes in the area, hoping that maybe they could find one that might be related in some way. And even though it felt like a long shot, police felt like they were onto something when they stumbled across the unsolved murder of Gina Wilson Green. Gina had been murdered 8 months earlier in her home on Stanford Avenue. Why is this important? You may be wondering. Well, remember how I mentioned that Charlotte and her roommate had just moved into their apartment? Guess where they lived before that? Oh wait, Stanford Avenue. Just 3 houses down from Gina Wilson Green. Police pretty quickly determined that there was a high likelihood that these cases were connected in some way. A suspicion they were able to confirm by comparing the DNA samples that had been taken from both scenes. Sure enough, they were a perfect match to one another. Police now knew without a shadow of a doubt that Gina Wilson Green and Charlotte Murray Pace had been brutally murdered by the same man. I mean, they still didn't know who the hell this guy was, but it was a step in the right direction and at the time probably felt like a huge break in the case. Because his identity remained a mystery, he was dubbed the Baton Rouge serial killer. With this new information, a multi-agency task force was created with the sole intention of tracking this man down. The task force began by creating a criminal profile. In their opinion, they were looking for a physically fit, white male between the ages of 25 and 30. Which, I mean, I get it. Most psychos are white, so really can't fault them there. They created a composite sketch of who they thought they were possibly looking for, released it to the public, and they actually got a lot of tips this way. Obviously, none of them amounted to literally anything, but man, they really thought they were onto something. They were so confident in their profile that they actually initiated a DNA dragnet of over 1,000 white men. And while they were busy being very, very far off track, Derrick struck again. On July 9th, 2002, Diane Alexander was getting ready for work when she heard a knock at her door. When she answered it, she was greeted by a very polite man who simply asked to borrow her phone. Unbeknownst to her, she was standing face to face with a serial killer. She offered him her phone and a phone book, but actually closed and locked her door while he stood outside and made his call. When he had finished his call, he knocked on the door again, and this time actually asked if he could speak to her husband. And when she told him that her husband wasn't home, the polite man she'd been speaking to flipped in an instant. He hit her over the head with her own phone and muscled his way inside of her home. He proceeded to beat Diane after his attempt to rape her was unsuccessful. He then attempted to strangle her with a phone cord that he had cut from the wall. Thankfully, Diane's son interrupted the attack when he returned home from school, which caused Derrick to flee the scene. Strangely, though, he chose to take the phone cord with him, which would turn out to be a big mistake on his part. Diane's son chased Derrick as far as he could before he got into a car and drove off. But not before Diane's son was able to get a really good look at him. Diane was really lucky to have survived the ordeal, but it took her almost a week to recover enough to give police a detailed description of her attacker. He was a nice, clean-looking guy with a thin mustache. And unlike the task force believed, and unlike the many serial killers we commonly think of, he was not white. But what's really fucking aggravating about all of this, it took months and 3 more victims before the task force got a hold of this information. Diane's attack was initially treated as a completely separate incident. The task force was not actively collaborating with local law enforcement, so they were still looking in the complete wrong direction for a suspect. Had they reached out to Zachary Police Department, who'd also been tracking these murders, they'd have learned that it was widely believed that the person responsible for Diane's attack and the Baton Rouge serial killer were one and the same. But due to the lack of communication, Derrick remained free to rob even more women of their lives. Likely enraged by his failed attempt on Diane's life, just 3 days later, on July 12th, 2002, Derrick kidnapped 44-year-old Pamela Kinnimore from her home. Pamela was a loving wife, mother, and business owner. She was eventually reported missing by her husband Byron, but after searching the Kinnimore's property, police came up with nothing. All they could determine was that the home had not been broken into. When Pam had returned home from work that evening, she'd left her keys dangling in the back door. Her husband had found them when he'd returned home that night. It took 4 days for Pam's body to finally be discovered. She was located just outside of Baton Rouge in Whiskey Bay. She had been raped and stabbed to death before her body had been hidden in some bushes. A couple hundred feet from Pam's body, police found a telephone cord. A telephone cord that was later determined to be the very same telephone cord used in the attempted strangulation of Diane Alexander. DNA results confirmed that this was indeed the same work of the man who had killed Gina Wilson Green, Charlotte Murray Pace, and Geraldine DeSoto, and Randy Mae Brewer, but no one had connected her disappearance to these crimes yet. This was a really scary time for everyone. Even with all the attention that these crimes were garnering from media and law enforcement, this man seemed to have no intention of backing down. Women began carrying guns and pepper spray and mostly only traveled in groups. They spent day in and day out in constant fear that they could be next. Sadly, that fear became reality for 2 more women. On November 21st, 2002, while visiting her mother's gravesite at a cemetery just outside of Baton Rouge, Trinicia Colombe was kidnapped by Derrick. Trinicia was a beautiful and extremely intelligent 23-year-old Army veteran with dreams of joining the United States Marine Corps. Her body was found 3 days later, just 20 miles from the cemetery after her abandoned car had been reported to police. She had been raped and beaten to death. Her murder was linked to the Baton Rouge serial killer by DNA that had been recovered from her body. And at this point, the task force is just baffled. They could not seem to get ahead of this man. They had virtually no evidence and, to their knowledge, no credible witnesses. It was like they were hunting for a ghost. Derrick's final victim was 26-year-old Carrie Lynn Yoder, whom he kidnapped from her LSU apartment in March of 2003. When her boyfriend didn't hear from her for 2 days, he reported her missing. Police initially searched her apartment, but really found no evidence to begin their investigation with. They were able to determine that robbery had not been a motive because Carrie's wallet, keys, and computer were all still in the home. Unfortunately, when asked by police, it turned out that none of her neighbors had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. Carrie's body was discovered 10 days later by a fisherman in Whiskey Bay. She was left near where Pam Kinnimore's body had been found, but unlike Pam, whose body had been carefully hidden, Carrie's body seemed to have been haphazardly tossed from a bridge. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled to death, and it was confirmed by DNA that the Baton Rouge serial killer was responsible for Carrie's death as well. The investigation was agonizing. Investigators felt no closer to finding answers at this point than they had almost a year ago when their search for this lunatic began. They were desperate. They had spent so much time trying to solve this case that over $500,000 in overtime had been paid to the detectives. Finally, in April 2003, everything kind of came to a head when a woman filed a complaint with the Zachary Police Department. She felt as though she was being followed, and given the circumstances, she wasn't going to take any chances. And neither was ZPD. They looked into the complaint and discovered boot prints outside of her bedroom window. And they assumed that their favorite neighborhood peeping Tom was likely to blame. This man's name, you ask? Derrick Todd Lee. On May 5th, 2003, unbeknownst to the task force, ZPD executed a warrant to obtain a DNA sample from Derrick. And when analyzed, his DNA came back as a perfect match to every murder committed by the Baton Rouge serial killer. After all this time, suddenly they had their man. Right away, in full force, authorities went to arrest him. But when they arrived at his home, it became apparent that he and his family had already dipped the fuck out. There was no sign of him at his home, at his mother's home, or at Cassandra's home. Not to mention that Derrick's wife had pulled their children out of school the day his DNA sample was taken. It was immediately announced that Derrick Todd Lee was the prime suspect in all of these widely publicized murders, so there realistically weren't many places he was going to be able to hide out. But he sure did give it a shot in Atlanta. However, he was eventually tracked down after a phone call that he made to a friend was traced, which ultimately led to his arrest right outside of a tire shop on May 27th, 2003. He was extradited back to Louisiana without incident, and in June of 2003, he was indicted for the murders. The defense argued that he was not competent to stand trial due to severe mental deficits. Derrick's IQ was determined to be just around 65, which is extremely low. For reference, the average person's IQ typically falls somewhere between 90 and 110. But this argument was dismissed, and Derrick was determined by a judge to be competent to stand trial. Prosecutors decided they had the best chance to convict on the murders of Charlotte Murray Pace and Geraldine DeSoto. So they chose to proceed with those charges in particular in hopes of securing either life in prison or the death penalty. On August 10th, 2004, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found Derrick guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Geraldine DeSoto. The verdict carried a mandatory life sentence. 2 months later, in October 2004, Derrick received his second conviction. He was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Charlotte Murray Pace. The case against him was strengthened immensely by the testimony of Diane Alexander. Following the recommendation of the jury, the judge sentenced Derrick to death by lethal injection. He was to spend the rest of his days on Earth on death row at Louisiana State Maximum Security Prison. However, Lee would not live long enough to see his sentence carried out. He died from heart disease on January 21st, 2016 at the age of 47. There is, and probably always will be, a ton of speculation surrounding Derrick's involvement in some other unsolved murders from the area, but he never confessed to anything, so we may never know the full extent of the murderous rampage of Derrick Todd Lee. Not to mention that multiple other serial killers were active in this area of Louisiana at this time, but we'll get more into that next week. In regards to Derrick, What do you think? Do you think that if his upbringing had been different, the outcome of his life might have been different? Derrick definitely had a shitty upbringing. So is that what ultimately broke him? I mean, it certainly doesn't excuse his actions, but maybe it kind of explains them? I don't know. I always feel uneasy trying to give these inexcusable actions an explanation. I never want to come across as like, because this happened to him, he did this and it balances in some way. Because that is most certainly not how I feel. I'm just fascinated by what psychologically causes people to do what they do in the whole nature versus nurture debate. At this point, I'm rambling, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to these women's stories. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out new true crime content each week, and I'd love to see you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.